Sometimes the cruelest wounds come from those who should love us most. For 26 years, Mara Ashworth has carried her family's shame like a stone in her chest, marked by a birthmark they call ugly and a gentle spirit they never valued. When the vampire lord of Blackwood Mountains demands tribute from their failing noble house, her siblings see their chance to be rid of her. They send Mara up the mountain path with mocking laughter, calling her their unwanted gift to the monster above. But Lord Eiran has lived centuries surrounded by empty beauty and false hearts. When he looks into Mara's steady eyes, he sees something that makes his ancient soul stir a kindness that has survived cruelty, a strength forged in solitude. What her family meant as mockery becomes the answer to his loneliness. What happens when the monster finds his perfect match in the woman they threw away? Before we continue, tell us where you're listening from, and if this touches you, subscribe because tomorrow brings something special. The autumn wind carried the scent of dying leaves through the cracked windows of Ashworth Manor, a once grand estate that now stood like a broken tooth against the grey sky. Lady Eleanor Ashworth twisted the tarnished silver ring, bearing her family's crest, a crown split down the middle, as prophetic now as it had been meaningless in her grandfather's time. The weight of that broken symbol pressed against her finger like the weight of their debts pressed against her conscience. "Mother, surely there must be another way," whispered Lyanna, the youngest of the Ashworth daughters, her golden hair catching what little light filtered through the moth-eaten tapestries. At 19, she still possessed the kind of ethereal beauty that made traveling merchants stumble over their words and forget their prices. Her porcelain skin had never known a day's hard work, her hands soft as silk from the expensive creams their dwindling fortune could barely afford. Eleanor's laugh held no warmth. "Another way? Child, we've sold everything of value save the roof over our heads. The creditors circle like vultures, and winter approaches with nothing in our stores." She gestured toward the empty hearth, where they'd burned the last of their furniture the previous week. "Your father's gambling debts won't pay themselves, and the harvest failed for the 3rd year running." From his chair by the cold fireplace, Marcus Ashworth, the middle child and only son, looked up from the ledger that had consumed his attention for months. At 23, he bore the sharp features of his mother's line, but lacked any of her former grace. His clothes, once fine, hung loose on his frame, testament to too many meals skipped to stretch their meager provisions. "The vampire's demand came at the perfect time," he said, his voice carrying a calculated coldness that made Lyanna shiver. "We give him what he wants, and our troubles disappear. You speak as if we're—" "Discussing livestock," Lyanna protested, though her voice lacked conviction. She'd grown up hearing the stories, the whispered tales of the Dark Lord who ruled from his castle high in the Blackwood Mountains. Every decade, he demanded tribute, a young woman of noble blood, to satisfy appetites that changed with his moods. Some said he drained them slowly, savoring their terror. Others whispered that he kept them as prisoners until their beauty faded, then cast them out to wander the mountains as madwomen. "Aren't we?" Marcus closed the ledger with a sharp snap. "One daughter in exchange for the family's survival. It's simple mathematics. But which daughter?" Eleanor's question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. None of them mentioned Mara. In the kitchen below, Mara Ashworth ground feverfew between her fingers, releasing its bitter scent into the warm air. Her leather-bound herbal journal lay open beside her, its pages yellow with age and filled with her careful script. Each recipe had been tested, each remedy proven through years of tending to the sick in their village. The kitchen had become her sanctuary, the one place in the manor where her presence was not just tolerated, but welcomed by the aging cook, who appreciated her gentle hands and vast knowledge of healing plants. The birthmark that covered the left side of her face from temple to jaw had darkened with age, a wine-colored stain that her family had declared a curse from the moment of her birth. Where Lyanna possessed golden beauty and Marcus sharp intellect, Mara had been gifted with different treasures, patience, wisdom beyond her 26 years, and hands that could coax life from dying things. But in a family that valued appearance above all else, such gifts went unnoticed. Miss Mara, called Agnes, the cook, from her place by the enormous stone hearth. At 60, she moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned to make much from little. The willow bark tea is ready for young Timothy. Mara nodded, carefully transferring the ground feverfew to a small cloth pouch. His mother says the fever broke yesterday, but we'll need to watch for signs of relapse. She had been tending to the blacksmith's son for a week, sitting by his bedside when his own family despaired, applying cool compresses and administering herbs that fought the sickness with gentle persistence. This was how Mara had always lived in the spaces between her family's grand gestures and dramatic pronouncements. While they schemed and worried and blamed each other for their reduced circumstances, she quietly kept the household functioning. She knew which merchants would still extend credit, which herbs grew best in the shadow of the manor's crumbling walls, and how to stretch a handful of grain into a meal that would satisfy their pride if not their hunger. Agnes settled heavily onto a wooden stool, her weathered hands folded over her apron. "They're up there talking about the vampire's demand again." "I know." Mara's voice remained steady, but her fingers stilled on the herbal journal. She had heard the raised voices, the desperate edge in her mother's tone, the cruel calculation in Marcus's words. She knew what conclusion they would reach, had known it from the moment the blood-red invitation had arrived 3 days ago. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do." Mara looked up from her work, meeting Agnes's concerned gaze with calm acceptance. "They need someone to blame for our misfortunes, and they need someone to sacrifice for our salvation. I've been both for years. This is simply the logical conclusion." The old cook's eyes filled with tears she was too proud to shed. She had watched Mara grow from a quiet child into a woman of remarkable strength, had seen her face each cruelty and disappointment with dignity and tact. "You're worth 10 of them." "Perhaps. But worth is determined by those who hold the scales, and they've never valued what I offer." Mara closed her journal and tied it with a worn ribbon. "I've made my peace with it long ago." Through the kitchen's small window, the Blackwood Mountains loomed dark against the afternoon sky. Their peaks remained snow-capped even in autumn, and shadows pooled in their valleys like spilled ink. Local legends claimed the mountains were older than human memory, that they had stood when dragons ruled the skies, and magic flowed as freely as water. Now they served as the domain of Lord Eiran, the vampire who had haunted their region for 3 centuries. The stories about him varied with each telling, but certain details remained consistent. He was ancient beyond mortal understanding, powerful enough to command the very stones of his mountain fortress, and possessed of appetites that grew stranger with each passing decade. Some tributes returned within days, babbling about magnificent chambers and impossible luxuries before disappearing forever into madness. Others were never seen again, their fates left to speculation and nightmares. But what intrigued Mara most were the older stories, the ones Agnes whispered on winter nights when wine had loosened her tongue. Tales of a time when Lord Eiran had been different, still dangerous, still otherworldly, but possessed of honor and even kindness toward those who approached him with genuine hearts. Those stories suggested that centuries of isolation had changed him, that the endless parade of beautiful, terrified tributes had worn away whatever humanity he might have once possessed. The kitchen door creaked open, and Marcus appeared with the careful composure he always wore when delivering unpleasant news. His thin face bore an expression of practiced regret that fooled no one who truly knew him. "Mara," he paused, as if gathering courage for a difficult speech. "Mother would like to speak with you in the solar." She nodded without surprise. Of course she would. Agnes reached out and squeezed Mara's hand, a gesture of comfort that spoke louder than words. They both knew what awaited in the solar, the formal announcement of a decision already made, the careful explanations that would frame sacrifice as duty and cruelty as necessity. Mara climbed the narrow stairs to the solar, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridors that had once buzzed with servants and guests. The solar itself had been the pride of Ashworth Manor in its glory days, with tall windows that caught the morning light and tapestries that depicted the family's illustrious history. Now it felt hollow, the faded glory serving only to emphasize how far they had fallen. Her mother stood with her back to the door, staring out at the mountains with the intensity of someone watching for either salvation or doom. Lyanna huddled in a chair by the empty fireplace, her beautiful face pale with guilt and relief in equal measure. The contrast between them struck Mara as painfully symbolic. Eleanor rigid with determination, Lyanna soft with unearned mercy. "You know why you're here," Eleanor said without turning around. "Yes." Mara stepped fully into the room, her hands clasped loosely before her. "You've chosen me to answer Lord Eiran's demand." "Chosen?" Eleanor's voice carried a bitter laugh, as if we had any real choice in the matter. She turned, and Mara saw how these past months had aged her mother, new lines around her eyes, grey threading through her dark hair, a tremor in her hands that spoke of constant worry. "Lyanna is too young, too fragile for such a fate. And Marcus is the heir," Mara finished gently. "I understand." Lyanna finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mara, I'm so sorry. If there were any other way—" "There isn't." Mara's tone held no accusation, only acceptance. "And even if there were, we all know I would still be the logical choice." She looked around the room, taking in the faces of her family, guilty, relieved, desperate, but not truly sorry. "When do I leave?" "Tomorrow at dawn," Marcus answered. The vampire's instructions were quite specific. "You're to arrive before sunset, alone, carrying nothing but what you can manage on foot." Mara nodded. She had expected this, had been preparing for it in her quiet way since the invitation arrived. Her few precious possessions were already sorted: her herbal journal, her grandmother's moonstone pendant, the small bag of seeds she had been saving for spring planting. Everything else could remain here, where it belonged to a life she was leaving behind. "The path up the mountain is treacherous," Eleanor added, her voice softening with something that might have been genuine concern. "Old Henrik says it takes most of the day to reach the castle, and the way is poorly marked. I'll manage." Mara had walked these mountains since childhood, gathering herbs in their hidden valleys, learning their moods and secrets. The path to Lord Eiran's domain might be rarely travelled, but mountains spoke a language. She understood. She turned to leave, then paused. "Mother, when people ask what became of me, what will you tell them?" Eleanor's composure cracked slightly. "That you served your family with honor. Will you believe it?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, as Mara left the solar and returned to her preparations. In the kitchen, Agnes had prepared her favorite meal, simple bread and cheese, but made with care and seasoned with affection. They ate together in comfortable silence, two women who understood each other's worth, even when the world chose blindness. As night fell over Ashworth Manor, Mara stood in her small chamber and packed the last of her belongings. Her herbal journal went into her travel bag first, its familiar weight a comfort against her palms. The moonstone pendant had been her grandmother's parting gift, bestowed with cryptic words about protection and hidden strength that had made little sense to a child, but resonated strangely now. Outside her window, the Blackwood Mountains waited in darkness, their peaks outlined against the star-scattered sky. Tomorrow she would walk into those shadows, leaving behind everything familiar to face a fate that existed beyond the realm of ordinary experience. But tonight, she felt something unexpected stirring in her chest, not fear, but anticipation. For the first time in her life, she was going somewhere she might be seen for who she truly was. The blood-red invitation had arrived on wings of shadow, carried by a raven whose eyes gleamed with unnatural intelligence. Agnes had found it at dawn 3 days ago, the parchment sealed with black wax that bore the impression of a mountain peak crowned with thorns. Even now, as Eleanor held it with trembling fingers, the paper seemed to pulse with its own dark heartbeat. "Read it again," Marcus demanded from his position by the window, though they all knew the words by memory. Eleanor's voice shook as she spoke the formal script that had been penned. In ink, the color of dried blood. "To the house of Ashworth, greetings. The season of tribute has arrived once more. By the ancient compact sealed between your ancestors and mine, one daughter of noble blood must present herself at my domain before the sun sets on the 7th day hence. She will come alone, bearing only what she can carry, prepared to fulfill whatever purpose I deem fitting. Failure to honor this obligation will result in consequences that extend far beyond your diminished household. Lord Eiran, master of Blackwood Peak. The compact, that cursed agreement, signed by Mara's great-grandfather in a moment of desperate greed, trading his descendants' freedom for gold that had long since been squandered. Every generation since had paid the price, sending daughters to disappear into the vampire's mountain fortress. Some returned within days, changed and strange. Others vanished forever, leaving only silence and speculation. 7 days, Lyanna whispered, her golden hair catching the weak morning light. That gives us 4 days left, Marcus interrupted, his calculations swift and merciless. Today is the 4th day since it arrived. Mara stood in the doorway, watching her family deliberate her fate with the detached interest of someone observing a play. She had spent the morning in the village, delivering the last of her healing tonics to those who needed them. The blacksmith's son was fully recovered now, his fever broken and his strength returning. Mrs. Hartwell's arthritic joints would trouble her less with the willow bark tea. Old Henrik's persistent cough had finally eased with the honey and elderflower mixture. Small victories, quiet kindnesses, the sum total of her life's work in this place that had never truly valued her contributions. "You're certain there's no other option?" Eleanor asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "No way to negotiate or delay," Marcus laughed bitterly. "Negotiate with a creature that has ruled these mountains for 3 centuries. Mother, he could destroy this entire valley if we displease him. The compact isn't a request, it's a command, backed by power beyond our understanding." "Perhaps if we sent Lyanna with guards," Eleanor began. "No," Lyanna's voice cracked with terror. "I won't go." "I can't, Mother, please. Don't ask me to." She dissolved into tears, her beauty marred by the red blotches that appeared whenever she cried. Mara stepped fully into the solar, her presence causing an uncomfortable silence to fall over the room. "It has to be me, doesn't it?" The relief that flooded her family's faces would have been comical if it weren't so painful. Marcus straightened his shoulders as if a great burden had been lifted from them. Eleanor's expression softened with what might have been gratitude. Even Lyanna stopped crying, though guilt still painted her delicate features. "You understand the situation," Marcus said carefully. "We need someone expendable," Mara finished quietly. "Someone whose loss won't diminish the family's prospects or break anyone's heart. I've always been the practical choice for such things." Eleanor flinched at the directness of the statement. We don't think of you as—" "Don't lie, Mother. We're past the point where pretty words matter." Mara moved to the window and looked out at the village below. Thin columns of smoke rose from chimneys as families prepared their midday meals. Children played in the streets, their laughter carrying on the autumn wind. Life continuing in all its ordinary, precious mundanity. "I've accepted my role in this family long ago. This is simply its natural conclusion. The vampire might not harm you, Lyanna offered desperately. Some of the tributes have returned. Changed, Mara said. Broken. Or mad. Yes, I know the stories. She turned from the window to face them all, but I also know I have little choice in the matter, and dwelling on possibilities won't change anything. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths and long-buried resentments. Finally, Marcus cleared his throat. When will you leave? Tomorrow at dawn. The path to his castle is long, and I need to arrive before sunset. Mara had already planned the journey in her mind, calculating distances and timing with the precision of someone who had spent years wandering the mountain paths. I'll need food for the day and a warm cloak. Of course. Eleanor moved toward her, perhaps intending some gesture of maternal comfort, but stopped when she saw the calm acceptance in Mara's eyes. Is there anything else? Anything we can? Give me a horse, Mara said simply. Not for the journey, I know the paths are too treacherous for riding, but I want to visit the families in the village, to say goodbye and leave final instructions for their medicines. Marcus opened his mouth to object. Horses were one of their few remaining assets, but Eleanor silenced him with a look. Take Moonbeam, she's gentle and sure-footed. Mara nodded her thanks and turned to leave, but Lyanna's voice stopped her. Mara, wait. The younger woman stood on unsteady legs, her beautiful face pale with shame. I need you to know, I wanted to go myself. I tried to volunteer, but Mother wouldn't hear of it. Did you? Mara studied her sister's face, reading the layers of truth and self-deception there. Or did you simply tell yourself you wanted to, knowing it would never be allowed? Lyanna's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, unable to find words that would transform cowardice into nobility. It doesn't matter, Mara continued gently. You're young and beautiful and beloved. You have every reason to want to live. I don't fault you for that. She left them then, closing the solar door behind her with a soft click that seemed to echo through the manor's empty corridors. In the kitchen, Agnes waited with red-rimmed eyes and a cloth bundle that smelled of fresh bread and apples. I packed what I could, the old woman said gruffly. Good bread, some cheese that won't spoil quickly, dried fruit, and a flask of wine for courage. Mara accepted the bundle with genuine gratitude. Thank you, for this and for everything else over the years. Don't talk as if you're already dead, Agnes snapped, though her voice broke on the words. That creature might surprise you, might find you more valuable than your family ever did. Perhaps. Mara tied the bundle to her belt and checked her other belongings. The herbal journal, her grandmother's pendant, a small purse of seeds, everything else she would leave behind. Will you watch over them when I'm gone? They'll need someone with sense to keep them from complete ruin. Agnes nodded, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. You're the best of them, child. Remember that when you face whatever waits in those mountains. The afternoon passed in a blur of farewells and final preparations. Mara rode Moonbeam through the village, stopping at each house where her healing had made a difference. She left careful instructions written on precious paper, explaining which herbs to gather and how to prepare them. The villagers received her visits with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow, understanding without being told that these were final goodbyes. Old Henrik pressed a carved wooden charm into her hand. My grandfather made this, said it would protect travelers in the high places. Keep your strength up, called Mrs. Hartwell from her doorway. And remember you're worth more than they ever knew. The blacksmith's wife brought little Timothy out to wave farewell, the boy's cheeks pink with health restored by Mara's patient care. Such small moments of connection, brief acknowledgments of her worth, they meant more than all her family's grudging tolerance combined. As evening approached, Mara returned to the manor to find her mother waiting. In the courtyard, Eleanor held a travelling cloak of deep blue wool, lined with fur that had survived from better days. It was my mother's, Eleanor said, as she settled the cloak around Mara's shoulders. She wore it when she first came to this house as a bride. The unexpected gift brought tears to Mara's eyes. "Mother, I know I haven't been," Eleanor's voice caught. "I know we haven't valued you as we should have. You deserved better from us." "Yes," Mara agreed quietly. "I did." The honesty of the statement hung between them. Neither accusation nor forgiveness, simply truth acknowledged at last. Eleanor's hands lingered on the cloak's fastenings, a gesture that might have been maternal if it hadn't come so late. That night, Mara lay in her narrow bed and listened to the wind howling around the manor's eaves. Tomorrow she would walk into legend, facing a fate that existed beyond the boundaries of ordinary life. But tonight, for the first time in years, she felt something approaching peace. She had spent her life being overlooked, undervalued, dismissed as the flawed daughter who brought shame rather than pride to the family name. Tomorrow, she would finally step out of that shadow and discover what lay beyond it, even if that discovery came at the ultimate price. In her dreams, she walked mountain paths under starlit skies, and something ancient and powerful waited at their end. Dawn broke grey and cold over Ashworth Manor, painting the crumbling stones in shades of silver and shadow. Mara stood in the courtyard with her meagre possessions, watching mist rise from the valley like the ghosts of better times. Her family gathered awkwardly nearby, Eleanor clutching a handkerchief, Marcus checking his pocket watch as if punctuality mattered to the supernatural, and Liana hovering between guilt and relief. The mountain path stretched before her, winding upward through stands of ancient pine and over rocky ledges that had witnessed centuries of tribute journeys. Local legends claimed the trail itself was cursed, that it shifted and changed to confuse unwelcome travelers. But Mara had always possessed an intuitive understanding of wild places, and as she began her ascent, the path seemed to welcome her steps. The climb proved more challenging than her childhood wanderings had prepared her for. The air grew thin as she gained elevation, and the temperature dropped with each hour of steady walking. By midday, her breath formed white clouds, and frost glittered on the pine needles, despite the autumn sun. But the physical demands of the journey paled beside the strange sense of anticipation that grew stronger with each step. As afternoon shadows lengthened, the forest gave way to bare rock and stunted trees that clung to cliffsides with desperate tenacity. Here the wind carried strange sounds, not quite music, not quite voices, but something that spoke of ancient power and long solitude. The very stones seemed to hum with otherworldly energy that made her grandmother's pendant grow warm against her chest. The castle appeared suddenly as she crested a final ridge, rising from the mountain peak like something born of the rock itself. Its dark towers clawed at the sky, and lights flickered in windows that watched her approach with the patience of centuries. No welcoming banners flew from its battlements, no guards challenged her presence. It simply waited, massive and silent, as if it had been waiting specifically for her arrival. The great gates stood open. Mara paused at the threshold, understanding that crossing would change everything forever. Behind her lay the world of ordinary human concerns, family cruelties, village gossip, the small kindnesses that made life bearable. Ahead waited mystery, danger, and perhaps something she had never dared hope for: acceptance of who she truly was. She stepped across the threshold. The courtyard beyond defied her expectations. Instead of the bone-littered wasteland described in village tales, she found herself in a space of stark but undeniable beauty. Black stone walls rose around her, carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift when viewed from the corner of her eye. A fountain played at the center, its water crystal clear despite falling from lips of a stone dragon whose eyes held too much intelligence for mere sculpture. "Welcome." The voice came from shadows near the main entrance, rich and deep with an accent that spoke of ages past. Lord Eiran stepped into the fading daylight, and Mara's breath caught despite her efforts to remain composed. He was not what the stories had prepared her for. Tall and lean, with the bearing of someone accustomed to absolute authority, but his face held more weariness than cruelty. Dark hair framed features that might have been carved by a master sculptor, too perfect to be entirely human, yet marked by a melancholy that spoke of profound loneliness. His eyes, pale as winter frost, studied her with an intensity that should have been frightening, but somehow felt like recognition. "Lord Eiran." Mara inclined her head respectfully, neither cowering nor challenging, simply acknowledging the reality of his presence. Those pale eyes widened slightly, surprise flickering across features that had clearly expected terror or pleading. "You know my name. I know the stories. Whether they bear any resemblance to truth remains to be seen." She met his gaze steadily, noting how her calm response seemed to intrigue rather than anger him. A smile ghosted across his lips, the first genuine expression she had seen from him. "The stories. Yes, I imagine they paint quite a picture. What do they say I should do with you? Drain my blood slowly while savoring my screams? Or keep me as a pet until my beauty fades and madness claims me? Or simply devour me immediately if I prove insufficiently entertaining?" Mara's tone remained conversational, as if discussing the weather, rather than her potential death. "And you came anyway." "I had little choice, but even if I had, yes, I would have come anyway. My life down there was hardly worth preserving." Eiran moved closer, his footsteps silent on the stone. "Your family sent you as tribute. My family sent me as a cruel jest. They believe you'll be disappointed by their offering and perhaps take your displeasure out on me rather than them. They consider it an elegant solution to several problems." The vampire's expression darkened, and for a moment Mara glimpsed the power that had inspired centuries of fear. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of ancient authority. "They mock me by sending someone they consider worthless? They mock me by sending someone they consider worthless to someone they consider monstrous. Whether they mock you depends on how you choose to interpret their gift." Her words hung in the air between them, challenging and honest in equal measure. Eiran studied her face, taking in the wine-colored birthmark that covered half her features, the simple clothes that marked her lower status within her family, the calm dignity that refused to bow before either his power or her own circumstances. "What is your name?" he asked finally. "Mara. Mara Ashworth, though I suspect that surname matters little here." "Mara." He repeated her name as if testing its flavor. "Why do you not fear me?" She considered the question seriously, tilting her head as she examined her own heart. "Perhaps I should. You could kill me with a thought, couldn't you? But fear seems pointless when I've already lost everything that made life bearable. What's the worst you could do? End my existence? That might be a mercy." "You speak of death very casually for one so young. I'm 26, Lord Eiran, old enough to understand that some fates are worse than dying, and wise enough to recognize when I might be facing something entirely different than what I expected." Eiran circled her slowly, his movements predatory, but somehow not threatening. "What did you expect? A monster, a creature of endless hunger and casual cruelty, someone who would see my family's contempt reflected in my face and respond accordingly. And instead, I find someone who seems as surprised by me as I am by him, someone who asks questions rather than simply taking what he wants." Mara turned to follow his movement, maintaining eye contact despite the intimidating nature of his scrutiny. "Someone who seems almost lonely." The word struck him like a physical blow. He stopped moving, his expression shifting through surprise, anger, and finally a weary resignation that confirmed her guess. "You see much for someone who has been here mere minutes. I've had years of practice reading people who wish I were invisible. You learn to notice what others prefer to hide." Mara gestured toward the castle around them. "This place is magnificent, but it feels empty, not just of people, but of purpose. Even your questions suggest you've grown tired of the usual responses to your presence. And what response do you offer instead? She smiled then, the expression transforming her marked face into something genuinely beautiful. Honesty, conversation, perhaps even companionship. If you can tolerate someone who refuses to pretend you're other than what you are. For a long moment, they stood in silence as shadows lengthened around them. Then Eiran gestured toward the castle's main entrance. Come. The evening grows cold, and we have much to discuss. I find myself curious about someone who would offer companionship to a monster. Only if you stop calling yourself that, Mara said as she followed him toward the massive doors. I've met true monsters, Lord Eiran. They rarely admit to their nature so readily. Behind them, the courtyard fountain continued its eternal song, and somewhere high in the castle's towers, ancient stones began to hum with something that might have been anticipation. The chambers Eiran led her to defied every expectation Mara had carried from the village tales. Instead of a dungeon cell or gilded prison, she found herself in a suite of rooms that spoke of comfort rather than captivity. Tall windows looked out over moonlit valleys, their glass so clear it might have been made from captured starlight. Rich tapestries covered the stone walls, depicting scenes from what looked like a dozen different centuries, and a fire crackled warmly in a hearth large enough to stand within. Her grandmother's moonstone pendant grew warm against her skin as she crossed the threshold, its gentle heat a reminder of protection that ran deeper than physical safety. The pendant had belonged to her grandmother's grandmother, passed down through generations of women who had possessed what the family politely called unusual sensitivities. Only now, standing in a place where magic hummed through the very stones, did Mara begin to understand what that inheritance might truly mean. These rooms have not been occupied for some time, Eiran said, moving to light additional candles with a gesture that required no flame. I trust they will suit your needs. They're beautiful. Mara touched the carved headboard of the bed, its wood polished to a warm glow by centuries of care. How long since someone stayed here? 47 years. The last tribute who accepted my hospitality rather than cowering in terror. Something flickered across his expression, regret perhaps, or the echo of an old disappointment. She lasted 3 days before the isolation drove her to madness. What happened to her? I sent her home with gold enough to secure her future and herbs to ease the memory of this place. She married a merchant and bore him 4 children. As far as I know, she lived happily. Mara studied his profile as he adjusted the window's heavy curtains. You checked on her welfare. I check on them all. The fund. The admission came quietly, as if he hadn't meant to voice it. The ones who survive their time here, who return to the world below, I need to know that sending them back was the right choice. And the ones who don't survive are fewer than the stories claim, but more than my conscience can easily bear. The honesty in his voice surprised her. She had expected arrogance from a creature of his power, perhaps casual indifference to mortal suffering. Instead, she found someone who carried the weight of 3 centuries like a stone around his neck. Why do you continue? The tribute, I mean. What purpose does it serve? Eiran moved to the fireplace, staring into flames that cast dancing shadows across his pale features. The compact your ancestor signed was more than simple words on parchment. It bound our fates together through blood and magic, creating obligations that transcend individual desires. I cannot simply choose to end it, but you could choose to end them quickly, painlessly. Instead, you house them in comfort and seek their conversation. Mara settled into a chair near the fire, noting how the flames seemed to burn brighter in his presence. Why? Perhaps because 3 centuries of solitude teaches a man to value any genuine human connection, no matter how brief. Or perhaps because you're not the monster everyone believes you to be. He turned to face her, his pale eyes reflecting firelight like winter ice touched by dawn. "You seem very certain of that assessment. I've seen true monsters, Lord Eiran. They don't question their own actions or feel regret for necessary cruelties. They don't check on the welfare of those they've released or house their prisoners in chambers fit for royalty. You know nothing of what I've done across the centuries. I know what your replies, doing now." Mara's voice remained calm but firm. "I know you could have drained me dry in your courtyard and instead brought me to warmth and safety. I know you answer my questions honestly when you could simply command my silence. Actions speak louder than reputation." Eiran was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the flames. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of old wounds. "The first few decades were different. I was different. Younger in ways that have nothing to do with physical appearance, angrier at the circumstances that made me what I am. The tributes then had more reason to fear me. What changed? Time, experience, the slow understanding that cruelty is a choice, not a requirement of my nature." He moved to the window, looking out at his mountain domain. "And perhaps the growing realization that I was destroying the only connections to humanity I was permitted." Mara rose and joined him at the window, standing close enough to feel the unusual coolness that emanated from his skin. The valley spread below them like a tapestry woven from moonlight and shadow, beautiful and utterly isolated. "It's lonely here," she observed. "Yes. How long since you've had a conversation that lasted longer than a few terrified minutes? Longer than you might imagine." He glanced at her sidelong. "You're remarkably calm for someone who should be fearing for her life." "Should I be? Fearing, I mean." The question hung between them, more complex than its simple words suggested. Eiran studied her face in the moonlight, taking in the wine-colored birthmark that her family had called a curse, the steady intelligence in her dark eyes, the quiet strength that had carried her up his mountain without complaint. "No," he said finally. "I don't believe you should." Something shifted in the space between them with that admission, a recognition that their relationship would not follow the pattern of predator and prey that had defined his previous encounters with tributes. Mara felt the change like a physical warmth, her grandmother's pendant pulsing gently against her heart. "Tomorrow, I would like to see more of your home," she said. "The stories speak of gardens that bloom out of season and libraries that contain the wisdom of ages. Are those true?" "Some of them. The library certainly exists, though its wisdom is debatable. The gardens—" He paused, something like embarrassment crossing his features. "The gardens have been neglected. They require a gentler touch than I possess. I might be able to help with that. I have some experience with growing things in difficult circumstances." "You would want to help?" "I would want to be useful. Sitting in beautiful rooms with nothing to occupy my hands or mind sounds like its own form of torment." Eiran turned from the window to face her fully. "Most tributes spend their time here trying to find ways to escape. Most tributes were probably sent here against their will by people who loved them. My situation is rather different." "How so?" "I was sent here against my will by people who despised me. That makes staying a form of rebellion rather than surrender." A laugh escaped him, genuine and surprised and utterly human. The sound transformed his austere features, revealing glimpses of the man he might have been before centuries of isolation carved lines of loneliness into his face. "You are not what I expected, Mara Ashworth." "Good. I've spent my entire life being exactly what people expected. The flawed daughter, the family burden, the woman too plain for marriage and too gentle for ambition. I find I rather like being unexpected." The fire crackled in the hearth, shadows dancing across walls that had witnessed 3 centuries of brief, tragic encounters. But tonight, something new stirred in the ancient stones, the possibility of connection that transcended the roles they were supposed to play. Outside, the mountain wind sang through the castle's towers, and somewhere in its song lay the promise of change. Dawn came softly to the mountain castle, painting the peaks beyond Mara's windows in shades of rose and gold. She woke naturally, without the jarring fear she had expected after her first night in a vampire's domain. The rooms remained unchanged in daylight, comfortable, welcoming, bearing no trace of supernatural threat. Her grandmother's pendant lay warm against her chest, as if it had absorbed protective energy throughout the night. The silver hand mirror on the dressing table caught her attention as she prepared for the day. Unlike the polished bronze mirrors she was accustomed to, this one showed her reflection with startling clarity. But more than that, when she looked into its surface, the birthmark that had defined her family's perception of her seemed somehow less prominent, as if the mirror chose to show inner character rather than surface flaws. A soft knock interrupted her contemplation. "Mara!" Eiran's voice came through the heavy door, oddly hesitant for someone who commanded absolute authority in this domain. "Come in." She set down the mirror and turned to face him. He entered with the careful movements of someone unaccustomed to requesting permission for anything. The morning light revealed details. The firelight had softened the marble pallor of his skin, the inhuman grace of his movements, the way shadows seemed to cling to him despite the bright sunshine. Yet his expression held none of the predatory menace the stories described. "I thought you might want to see the gardens," he said. "You mentioned an interest yesterday. I would like that very much." He led her through corridors lined with tapestries that depicted the castle's history across centuries. Some showed scenes of medieval grandeur, knights and ladies in elaborate dress, tournaments and celebrations that spoke of a time when this place hosted more than reluctant tributes. Others depicted quieter moments, scholars bent over ancient texts, artists capturing beauty in stone and paint, gardeners tending to plants that bloomed with supernatural vitality. "This was different once," Mara observed, pausing before a tapestry that showed the great hall filled with light and laughter. "Very different. Before the compact, before the isolation, this was a place where learning and beauty flourished. Artists and scholars came from distant lands to study and create." Eiran's voice carried the weight of old loss. "I was different then as well." "What changed?" "The curse that made me what I am came with conditions. I could retain my domain and a measure of my former power, but only in isolation. The compact with your ancestors was meant to provide the minimal human connection necessary to preserve what remained of my humanity. And instead, it became a source of pain. For everyone involved, yes." They emerged onto a terrace that overlooked what had once been magnificent gardens. The bones of former beauty remained elegant pathways, ornate fountains, raised beds arranged in complex geometric patterns. But neglect had taken its toll. Vines choked the pathways, fountains sat dry and leaf-clogged, and only the hardiest plants survived in soil gone wild. "How long since anyone tended this properly?" Mara asked, moving among the overgrown beds with the practiced eye of someone who understood growing things. "Decades. The last gardener was one of the tributes. She had knowledge similar to yours, and for a brief time this place bloomed again." He gestured toward a section where roses grew in magnificent profusion despite the overall neglect. "Those are hers. They've survived without care far longer than they should have." She cared for them with more than just knowledge. Mara knelt beside the roses, inhaling their impossible fragrance. "There's love here. It lingers in the soil. You can sense such things? My grandmother could. My great-grandmother as well. The women in my family have always understood growing things, healing things. It's why my herbal remedies work better than they should." She touched her grandmother's pendant, feeling its warmth pulse in response to the garden's dormant magic. "I think it's why my family feared me as much as they dismissed me." Eiran moved closer, studying her face with new interest. "The pendant you wear, it's not merely ornamental. No, It was my grandmother's protection, and her grandmother's before that. Each generation passed it down to the daughter who showed the gift. Mara stood, her hands already dirty from examining the soil. I think they knew somehow that I would need its protection more than most. For what purpose? Perhaps for this, perhaps to survive long enough to find where I truly belong. The words hung between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to examine fully. Instead, Eiran gestured toward a toolshed that stood at the garden's edge. If you truly wish to help, you'll find what you need there. Though, I warn you, this soil has been touched by magic for centuries. It may not respond as you expect. Mara smiled, the expression transforming her marked face into something luminous. Magic soil sounds like exactly the challenge I've been waiting for my entire life. She spent the morning exploring the garden's potential, mapping out what could be saved and what needed complete renewal. Eiran remained nearby, ostensibly reading but clearly watching her work with fascination. His presence should have been intimidating, but instead she found it oddly comforting, like having a guardian whose protection came without conditions or judgment. As the sun reached its zenith, she paused in her work to find him studying her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. "What is it?" she asked. "You're humming." "Oh." She felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm sorry. I didn't realize. Don't apologize. It's the first music these gardens have heard in 40 years. The simple statement carried such profound loneliness that Mara's heart ached in response. She moved toward him, noting how he didn't retreat from her approach as he might have with others. "You could have music any time you wished," she said gently. "Surely your power extends to such simple pleasures. Power can create the sound of music, but not its soul. Music without genuine feeling is merely noise. Then I'll hum while I work, if you don't mind. These plants seem to like it." And she gestured toward a section where her morning's efforts had already begun to show results, green shoots emerging from soil that had seemed dead hours before. And you deserve to hear music that comes from joy rather than duty." Something shifted in his pale eyes, surprise, gratitude, perhaps the first stirring of something deeper. For a moment, the centuries that separated them seemed to fall away, leaving only two souls who had found unexpected recognition in each other. "Mara," he said softly. "Yes? Thank you." She returned to her work. But now, her humming carried new purpose, not just to encourage the plants, but to fill the ancient silence with something beautiful and alive. Behind her, Eiran listened with the intensity of someone hearing hope for the first time in centuries. 3 weeks into her residence at the castle, Mara fell ill with a fever that came on suddenly and without warning. She had been working in the herb garden when dizziness overcame her, forcing her to sit heavily on a stone bench while the world spun around her. Eiran found her there an hour later, pale and shivering despite the afternoon warmth. The star-map tapestry in his private study had caught her attention during their evening conversations, an ancient celestial chart that tracked the passage of time across centuries. Now, as Eiran carried her to her chambers with inhuman gentleness, she noticed how his pale eyes kept drifting to the windows, calculating something she didn't understand. "It's just a fever," she protested weakly as he laid her on the bed with the care one might show. "To fragile glass." "No." His voice carried absolute certainty and barely controlled fear. "This is something else." For 3 days, the fever consumed her. Strange dreams plagued her sleep visions of Eiran's past that came with perfect clarity despite her unconscious state. She saw him as he had been centuries ago, a scholar lord whose domain had been a beacon of learning and culture. She witnessed the curse that had transformed him, born from the jealousy of a rival who could not bear his success. Most painfully, she experienced his centuries of isolation, the slow erosion of hope as tribute after tribute either fled in terror or succumbed to madness. Through it all, Eiran never left her side. He applied cool cloths to her burning skin, administered ancient remedies from his own collection, and spoke to her in languages she didn't recognize but somehow understood. When the fever dreams grew too intense, his voice became her anchor to consciousness, calling her back from visions that threatened to trap her in his painful memories. On the fourth morning, the fever broke. Mara woke to find him slumped in the chair beside her bed, his perfect composure finally cracked by exhaustion and worry. Dark circles shadowed his pale eyes, and his usually immaculate appearance showed signs of 3 days spent in constant vigilance. The sight of his vulnerable state moved her more than any declaration could have. "Eiran," she whispered, her voice rough from fever. His eyes snapped open immediately, the relief that flooded his features so profound it took her breath away. "You're awake. How do you feel?" "Like I've been trampled by a herd of horses, but alive." She struggled to sit up, accepting his assistance without protest. "You look terrible." A laugh escaped him, rusty from disuse, but genuine. "I've had better weeks. You stayed with me the entire time." "Yes." He made no attempt to explain or justify the choice. "The dreams I had, were they real? The visions of your past?" His expression grew guarded. "What did you see?" "Everything. Your life before the curse, the transformation, the loneliness that followed. The way each failed tribute added to your isolation until you began to believe you truly were the monster others named you." She reached out tentatively and touched his hand, noting how he didn't pull away. "I understand now why you've grown weary of existence. Those visions should not have been possible. The fever was my body's way of processing the connection between us." Mara's voice carried new certainty. "The pendant, my bloodline. Whatever magic flows through this place, it's all connected. The dreams weren't random fever hallucinations. They were truth." Eiran stared at their joined hands, his expression cycling through wonder and fear. "What does that mean?" "I don't know yet, but I know I'm not the same person who climbed your mountain 3 weeks ago, and neither are you." Before he could respond, shouts echoed from the courtyard below. They moved to the window together, looking down to see a delegation of villagers gathered at the castle gates. Mara recognized several faces, including her brother Marcus, mounted on his horse and carrying what appeared to be an official document. "They've come for you," Eiran said, his voice flat with resignation. "Have they?" Mara studied the group below, noting the mix of determination and fear on their faces. "Or have they come to challenge your right to keep me?" Marcus's voice carried clearly in the mountain air as he addressed the castle directly. "Lord Eiran, we demand the return of our sister. She has been here far longer than any previous tribute, and we fear she has been enchanted beyond reason." "Enchanted beyond reason?" Mara repeated, anger sparking in her dark eyes. "How convenient. If I'm enchanted, they needn't consider that I might have chosen to stay. Have you chosen to stay?" She turned from the window to face him. "Fully. Yes, but not because of enchantment." "Then why?" "Because for the first time in my life, I am valued for who I am rather than dismissed for who I'm not. Because working in your gardens and sharing your evening conversations has shown me what my life could be if I stopped accepting other people's limited vision of my worth." She moved closer, noting how his breathing changed as she approached. "Because when you look at me, you see Mara, not the flawed daughter or the unmarriageable burden or the family joke. Mara," he said softly, and her name on his lips sounded like prayer. "I need you to understand something." She reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the sharp line of his cheekbone. "If I leave with them now, it will be because they force me, not because I want to go." The delegation below had grown restless, their demands becoming more insistent. Marcus had dismounted and was examining the castle gates as if calculating their defenses. Behind him, other villagers clutched crude weapons and protective charms. "They think you're holding me prisoner," Mara observed. "Aren't I? Are you?" She moved to the window and threw it open, her voice carrying clearly down to the courtyard. "Marcus, I am here by my own choice. Return home and tell Mother I am well and happy." "Mara!" Her brother's relief was audible. "You must come down. We've brought a priest to break whatever spell holds you." "There is no spell," she called back. "Only a choice I've made freely. Then come down and prove it. Show us you can leave if you wish." The challenge hung in the air between the castle and the delegation below. Mara felt Eiran tense beside her, understanding that everything they had built together hung in the balance of her next decision. "I'll go down to them," she said quietly. "I'll prove that I'm here willingly. And if they try to take you by force, then you'll have to decide what my freedom is worth to you." She left him, standing at the window, and made her way down to the courtyard, her steps steady despite the lingering weakness from her illness. Behind her, she felt his presence like a physical warmth, and knew that whatever happened next would define not just her future, but the future of a connection that had already changed them both beyond recognition. Mara descended into the courtyard with measured steps, her hand instinctively touching the moonstone pendant that had grown warmer with each passing day at the castle. The delegation awaited her with a mixture of relief and suspicion, Marcus fidgeting with official-looking documents, the village priest clutching his holy symbols, and behind them a handful of armed men who clearly expected trouble. "Sister," Marcus called out as she approached, "thank the gods you appear unharmed. We feared the worst when you didn't return." "Why would I return?" Mara's voice carried a calm authority that made several villagers step back nervously. "I was sent here as tribute, not as a guest with visiting privileges. But surely you've fulfilled your obligation by now. The vampire has had his entertainment and custom dictates—" "Custom dictates nothing about this situation," Mara interrupted. "I am here because I choose to be." Father Benedict, the village priest, stepped forward with his crucifix raised defensively. "Child, you speak words that are not your own. The creature has clouded your mind with unholy influence. But we've brought salvation. Put that away." Mara's command rang with such unexpected authority that the priest actually lowered his crucifix. "You know nothing of what you're dealing with here." Marcus pulled a scroll from his saddlebags, his hands trembling slightly as he unrolled it. "Mara, there are things you don't understand, things our family has hidden for generations. This document, I found it in Father's private papers after we received word of your situation. The parchment was ancient, its edges yellowed and cracked with age. As Marcus held it up, Mara felt her pendant grow suddenly hot against her skin, the warmth spreading through her chest like liquid fire. "What does it say?" she asked, though some deep part of her already knew the answer would change everything. "It's a bloodline record," Marcus said, his voice strained, "dating back 7 generations. Mara, you're not just any Ashworth daughter. You're descended from Lady Eiran Ashworth, who was the vampire's ally," Father Benedict finished grimly. "The woman who stood with the Dark Lord against the Church's attempts to cleanse these mountains of unholy influence." The ancient bloodline scroll seemed to pulse with its own energy as the truth spilled out in the tile. Mountain air. Mara felt the world tilt around her, understanding flooding through her consciousness like water through a broken dam. "Lady Eiran was your great-great-great-grandmother," Marcus continued. "She possessed abilities that the family has tried to bred out for generations, gifts that marked her as different, dangerous. The birthmark you bear isn't a curse, Mara. It's a sign. The same mark that appeared on every woman in her line who inherited her power." "Power?" Mara's voice came out as barely a whisper. "The ability to bridge the gap between mortal and immortal, to serve as an anchor for supernatural beings who might otherwise lose their humanity entirely." Father Benedict's voice dripped with disgust. She bound herself to the vampire through blood magic, became his conscience and his connection to the mortal world. The priest pulled out another document, this one bearing the official seal of the church. When the compact was signed by your ancestor, it wasn't just about tribute. It was about maintaining a bloodline, ensuring that each generation would produce at least one woman capable of serving the vampire's true needs. You're saying I was bred for this purpose? Anger flared in Mara's chest, hot and emblet, righteous. The family tried to prevent it, Marcus said desperately. They hid the truth, discouraged the old practices, tried to convince themselves that the blood had thinned enough over the generations. They sent you here thinking you were powerless, that the vampire would find you lacking and dispose of me quickly, Mara finished. They thought they were sending a failed daughter to her death, when in fact they were sending the one person who could fulfill the compact's true purpose. From the castle entrance, Eiran's voice carried across the courtyard with the weight of centuries behind it. The truth has consequences, priest. Are you prepared to face them? He emerged from the shadows like darkness given form, his presence causing the villagers to clutch their weapons nervously. But his attention focused entirely on Mara, concern and something deeper burning in his pale eyes. You knew, she said, the words not quite an accusation but close to it. I suspected. Your ability to see my memories during the fever, the way the castle's magic responds to your presence, the unprecedented calm. You've shown in my domain these things suggested a connection deeper than mere chance. He moved closer, ignoring the nervous shuffling of the armed men. But I hoped I was wrong. Why? Because if I was right, it meant your family had been lying to you for your entire life. It meant they sent you here not out of cruelty, but out of ignorance so profound it bordered on criminal negligence. Father Benedict raised his crucifix again. The bloodline can be severed. The church has developed rituals that would kill her. Eiran finished coldly. The connection is too deeply rooted. Attempting to sever it now would destroy the very essence of who she is. Mara looked around the courtyard, taking in the faces that surrounded her fearful villagers, her desperate brother, the fanatical priest, and the ancient being who had somehow become the most honest presence in her life. The moonstone pendant burned against her chest, its heat now spreading through her entire body as the truth of her heritage awakened abilities that had been dormant for decades. How long have you known about Lady Alara? She asked Marcus. Father told me on his deathbed, made me swear to protect you from the knowledge, to ensure you never came to the vampire's attention. We thought if we could marry you off quickly, get you away from these mountains. You thought you could erase what I am. We thought we could save you. From what? From the only place I've ever been valued. From the only person who's ever seen me as something other than a burden or a disappointment. Mara's voice rose, and with it, the very air around her seemed to shimmer with otherworldly energy. The villagers stepped back in alarm as flowers began to bloom along the courtyard's stone walls, impossible blossoms that opened in defiance of season and soil, their beauty ethereal and faintly luminous. The fountain at the courtyard's center, dry for decades, suddenly bubbled to life, with water that caught and reflected light like liquid diamonds. "My God," whispered one of the villagers, "she's one of them." "No," Eiran said firmly, "she's something rarer, something the world has not seen for generations." He moved to stand beside Mara, not touching but close enough that their combined presence made the very stones hum with power. "She is what bridges the gap between mortal and immortal, what makes redemption possible for creatures like me." "And what does that make you now?" Father Benedict demanded, his voice shrill with fear and anger. Mara looked at the priest, then at her brother, then at the assembled villagers who had come to rescue her from a fate she had chosen freely. Finally she turned to Eiran, seeing in his pale eyes the reflection of her own transformation. "It makes me free," she said simply. "For the first time in my life, it makes me free." The bloodline scroll in Marcus's hands suddenly burst into flames that burned white-hot and clean, leaving no ash, no trace of its existence except the truth it had revealed. Around the courtyard, the impossible flowers continued to bloom, and in their beauty lay the promise of a power that could reshape the very nature of the compact that had bound their families for generations. Everything Mara had believed about herself, everything her family had tried to hide, everything the world had assumed about the vampire's domain, all of it crumbled and reformed in the space between one heartbeat and the next. She was not the flawed daughter sent as mockery. She was not the powerless tribute offered in desperation. She was the heir to a legacy of power that had been waiting centuries for her to claim it. And in claiming it, she would change not just her own fate, but the fate of everyone who dwelt in the shadow of Blackwood Peak. The revelation of Mara's true heritage sent ripples through the courtyard like stones dropped into still water. The villagers huddled together, their crude weapons useless against the supernatural forces now awakening around them. Father Benedict clutched his holy symbols with white-knuckled desperation, while Marcus stared at his sister as if seeing her for the first time. But the confrontation was far from over. The sound of approaching horses echoed from the mountain path below, more riders climbing toward the castle with purpose that spoke of careful planning rather than spontaneous rescue. Eiran's expression darkened as he recognized the steady rhythm of trained war horses and the distinctive clink of blessed weapons. "The church has sent more than a village priest," he said grimly. Within the hour, a second delegation arrived at the castle gates. These were not frightened villagers armed with farming tools, but professional vampire hunters bearing the consecrated weapons and sacred armor of the church militant. At their head rode Sir Gareth Blackwood, a knight whose reputation for destroying supernatural creatures was matched only by his absolute certainty in his divine mission. Behind the hunters came an even more devastating presence, Eleanor Ashworth, accompanied by Lyanna and a marriage contract that would bind Mara to Lord Aldrich of Westmere before the week's end. "The church has offered protection and a substantial dowry," Eleanor announced as she dismounted near her son. "Lord Aldrich is willing to overlook your condition in exchange for the alliance our families require." "Condition?" Mara's voice carried dangerous calm. "You mean the heritage you've spent my entire life trying to hide?" "We mean the corruption that has clearly taken root in your soul," Sir Gareth interjected, his hand resting on the pommel of a sword that gleamed with more than mere steel. "The vampire's influence grows stronger with each passing day. Soon you will be lost to us entirely." The obsidian binding stone. That Eiran wore at his throat, an artifact Mara had noticed but never questioned, began to pulse with dark energy. She felt its pull like a physical tether, understanding for the first time that it was more than mere ornamentation. The stone could either cement their supernatural bond permanently or, if broken, would destroy them both. "There is a way to save her," Father Benedict proclaimed, producing a vial of what appeared to be liquid silver, a purification ritual that can cleanse the bloodline corruption, though it requires her willing participation in her own spiritual death, Eiran finished coldly. "The ritual doesn't purify anything, priest. It burns away everything that makes her unique, everything that gives her power, everything that makes her who she is." "Better a living woman diminished than a creature of darkness enhanced," Sir Gareth replied. Mara felt the weight of choice pressing down on her like the mountain itself. To her left stood her family, offering the safety of a conventional marriage, the promise of a normal life purchased at the cost of everything she had discovered about herself. To her right stood Eiran, offering a connection that transcended mortality, but which came with isolation from everything she had known. And between them stood the representatives of the church, offering purification through destruction. "You speak of choice," she said finally, addressing the assembled crowd. "But every option you present requires me to surrender some essential part of myself. My family would have me abandon my power. The church would have me destroy it. Only Lord Eiran has asked nothing of me except to be exactly who I am. Because he seeks to corrupt you. Sir Gareth's voice rang with absolute conviction. The vampire's nature is to take, to consume, to destroy innocence. Then explain the gardens that bloom where I walk. Explain the fountain that runs clear for the first time in decades. Explain how a creature of destruction has tended my fever with healing remedies and listened to my thoughts without judgment. Mara's power stirred around her, making the air itself shimmer with otherworldly energy. Explain how I have grown stronger rather than weaker in his presence. Eleanor stepped forward, her face pale but determined. Mara, please, you're our daughter. We've failed you, I know that now, but we can still what, Mother? Still pretend that I'm something I'm not? Still hide the truth of what I am, and wonder why I never seem to fit the shape you insisted I fill? We can still save you from making a choice you'll regret forever, Marcus said desperately. Lord Aldrich has agreed to the marriage, despite everything. You could have a normal life, children, a household to manage, respect. Whose respect? Mara's question cut through his plea like a blade. His, bought with dowries and political necessity. Yours, purchased with my silence about what you've hidden from me, or the churches, gained by burning away everything that makes me more than ordinary? Sir Gareth raised his consecrated sword, its blade humming with holy power. Enough debate. The creature's influence over her grows stronger with every moment. We take her now, willing or not, and perform the purification before it's too late. The knight's declaration shattered the last pretense of negotiation. Battle lines formed across the courtyard as the vampire hunters spread out, their blessed weapons gleaming in the afternoon light. Behind them, the villagers retreated to what they hoped was a safe distance, while the Ashworth family clustered together in terrified confusion. Eiran moved to place himself between Mara and the approaching knights, power radiating from him like heat from a forge. But she saw the conflict in his pale eyes. His supernatural strength could easily overwhelm the hunters, but using it would confirm every terrible story ever told about his kind. There's another way, Mara said quietly, her voice somehow carrying clearly across the tense courtyard. A choice none of you have considered, because it requires accepting what I've become rather than trying to change it. She stepped forward, positioning herself between the opposing forces. The obsidian binding stone at Eiran's throat pulsed faster, responding to her proximity and the awakening power in her blood. The compact that bound our families was never about tribute in the traditional sense. It was about maintaining balance, ensuring that supernatural power remained anchored to human compassion, that immortal beings retained connection to mortal understanding. Her grandmother's pendant burned against her chest as she spoke, its warmth spreading through her like liquid starlight. Lady Alara understood this when she first allied with Lord Eiran. She became his conscience, his reminder of what it meant to value life rather than simply possess it. Blasphemy, Sir Gareth snarled. No alliance with darkness can serve the light. Then explain why these mountains have known peace for 3 centuries under his rule. Explain why no armies of undead march from Blackwood Peak, why the surrounding valleys flourish despite their supernatural guardian. Explain why the tribute system, for all its apparent cruelty, has actually protected this region from far worse fates. The knight hesitated, his absolute certainty wavering for the first time. The church teaches that supernatural creatures are irredeemably evil, Mara continued. But if that were true, why would my bloodline possess the power to influence them? Why would divine providence allow abilities that can guide darkness toward light? Because, Eiran said softly, understanding flooding his pale features, redemption is always possible, even for creatures like me. The compact wasn't a curse, it was a gift. A chance to remember what I once was, to choose what I could become. Father Benedict raised his vial of liquid silver desperately. The ritual can still cleanse. The ritual can still murder, Mara corrected. Just as Sir Gareth's sword can still execute, and my family's marriage contract can still imprison. But none of these choices serve justice or mercy or even genuine protection. They serve only fear. She turned to face each group in turn, her family, the church representatives, the vampire hunters. I am Mara Ashworth, heir to Lady Alara's bloodline and bearer of abilities that can bridge mortal and immortal worlds. I choose to embrace that heritage fully, not to serve darkness, but to ensure that power is always tempered with compassion. The obsidian binding stone pulsed brighter as she moved toward Eiran, and I choose to bind myself willingly to Lord Eiran, not as his victim or his conquest, but as his partner in maintaining the balance that has protected these mountains for centuries. Sir Gareth raised his sword with renewed determination. Then you choose damnation, and we must prevent it. Then you choose war, Eiran replied, his power coiling around him like living shadow. And I must end it. The moment balanced on a knife's edge, supernatural forces gathering like storm clouds, while mortal determination sharpened into deadly intent. In seconds, the courtyard would become a battlefield where the very stones might not survive the conflict between blessed weapons and vampiric fury. But in that crucial instant, before violence erupted, Mara made the choice that would determine not just her own fate, but the fate of everyone who called Blackwood Peak their home. She reached for the obsidian binding stone. The moment Mara's fingers closed around the obsidian binding stone, the courtyard erupted into chaos. Sir Gareth's blessed sword sang through the air toward her throat, its divine radiance cutting through the afternoon shadows like a falling star. But before the blade could find its mark, Eiran moved with inhuman speed, his own, darkness rising to meet the night's holy light. The collision of supernatural forces sent shockwaves through the ancient stones, cracks spiderwebbing across the courtyard's flagstones as power beyond mortal comprehension clashed in the space between heartbeats. Sir Gareth stumbled backward, his consecrated armor smoking from contact with vampiric energy, while Eiran snarled with pain as holy fire seared across his pale skin. "Stop!" Mara's voice rang with newfound authority, the obsidian stone burning cold against her palm as her inherited power awakened fully. "This serves nothing but violence." But her words were lost in the melee that followed. The vampire hunters spread out in practiced formation, their blessed weapons weaving nets of sacred light designed to contain and destroy supernatural creatures. Father Benedict began chanting in ancient Latin, his voice rising above the sound of steel meeting shadow as he attempted to invoke divine intervention. Eleanor Ashworth screamed her daughter's name, while Marcus tried desperately to pull her toward the castle gates and safety. The villagers scattered like frightened birds, their simple weapons forgotten in their panic to escape forces far beyond their understanding. Through it all, Mara stood at the center of the storm, the binding stone pulsing with dark energy that seemed to respond to her touch. She could feel Eiran's pain as if it were her own, could sense his struggle to protect her without unleashing the full extent of his destructive power. The connection between them, forged through weeks of conversation and understanding, now blazed with supernatural intensity that threatened to overwhelm her mortal mind. "He's holding back," she realized aloud, watching Eiran parry another blessed blade while carefully avoiding lethal counterstrikes. "He could destroy them all, but he won't kill them because of me." The revelation came with crushing understanding. His restraint would be his destruction. The hunters had come prepared for a monster who would fight with unlimited savagery, not one who valued human life enough to accept wounds rather than deal death. Sir Gareth's tactical brilliance lay not in overpowering Eiran, but in exploiting the very compassion that made him worthy of redemption. A second hunter's blade slipped past Eiran's guard, blessed steel carving a line of holy fire across his shoulder. He staggered, dark blood steaming where it hit the ancient stones, and Mara felt his agony echo through their connection like a knife twist in her chest. "Enough!" she cried, and power erupted from her in waves that sent everyone in the courtyard reeling. The Dawn sword that Sir Gareth carried, a legendary blade, said to be capable of permanently destroying even the most powerful vampire, gleamed with terrible purpose as he raised it for a killing blow. But as the weapon descended toward Eiran's exposed back, Mara made a choice that would echo through eternity. She threw herself between them. The blessed steel, forged to destroy creatures of darkness, struck her instead, and something impossible happened. Rather than cutting through mortal flesh, the blade met the awakened power of her bloodline and stopped as if hitting solid stone. Holy light and supernatural energy collided in her body, creating a maelstrom of force that should have torn her apart. Instead, it transformed her. Pain beyond description flooded through every nerve as her mortal form struggled to contain energies that existed beyond normal reality. But through the agony came understanding. This was what Lady Alara had endured centuries ago when she first bound herself to Eiran's fate. This was the price and the privilege of bridging two worlds. Sir Gareth stared in shock as his Dawn sword, which had never failed to cut through supernatural flesh, remained lodged harmlessly against Mara's chest, where her grandmother's pendant blazed with protective light. "Impossible," he breathed. "The sword cuts through any darkness." "Because I'm not darkness," Mara gasped, her voice strange with new harmonics that spoke of power settling into mortal form. "I'm balance. I'm the bridge between what you fear and what you could understand if you chose wisdom over warfare." Behind her, Eiran struggled to his feet, his pale eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. "Mara, what have you done? What I was born to do." She turned to face him, and he saw that her dark eyes now held flecks of the same otherworldly light that had marked Lady Alara in the old paintings. "What my bloodline has always been meant to do, stand between mortal and immortal worlds and remind both sides of their better nature." The binding stone in her hand pulsed once, twice, then cracked down the middle. But instead of shattering completely, it reformed itself around her fingers like a ring of living obsidian, sealing their connection in ways that transcended the physical artifact. Around the courtyard, the vampire hunters lowered their weapons in confusion and growing fear. This was not how their battle was supposed to unfold. Their enemy was supposed to be a clear manifestation of evil, not a young woman whose power seemed to spring from the very light they claimed to serve. "What are you?" Sir Gareth demanded, his voice shaking. "I am what happens when ancient bloodlines remember their purpose," Mara replied. "I am what your church forgot was possible redemption made manifest." The transformation that had begun with the Dawn sword's failed strike continued to ripple through Mara's being, each wave of change bringing new understanding and terrible clarity. She could feel every life in the courtyard as distinctly as her own heartbeat, the fear-driven determination of the vampire hunters, the confused terror of her family, the ancient weariness and newfound hope warring in Eiran's supernatural essence. "Look around you," she said to the assembled crowd, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in the very stones. "Look at what your violence has accomplished." The courtyard bore witness to the futility of their conflict. Scorch marks from blessed weapons scarred the ancient flagstones, while dark stains marked where Eiran's blood had fallen. The fountain that had bloomed to life under Mara's influence now ran red with the aftermath of battle, and the impossible flowers that had sprouted from stone walls wilted as supernatural energies clashed. But even as she spoke, her presence began to reverse the damage. Where her feet touched the cracked stones, new growth appeared, not the wild profusion of awakening power, but controlled, purposeful healing that mended what had been broken. The fountain's water ran clear once more, and the withered flowers lifted their heads toward a sun that seemed brighter in her vicinity. Sir Gareth raised his sword again, though his hands trembled with uncertainty. "Sorcery," he declared, but his voice lacked conviction. "Dark magic mimicking divine grace. Is that what you see?" Mara asked gently. "Or do you see something that challenges your certainty about the nature of good and evil?" The unity chalice that had appeared on the castle's steps, an ancient goblet carved from a single piece of starlight-pale stone, began to glow with soft radiance. None present remembered it arriving, as if the artifact had materialized from legend itself to witness this moment of choice. Eleanor Ashworth broke free from Marcus's protective grip and stumbled toward her transformed daughter. "Mara," she whispered, tears streaming down her face, "I'm so sorry. We never understood. You understood exactly what you needed to understand," Mara replied, reaching out to touch her mother's face with infinite gentleness. "You preserved the bloodline through generations of fear and misunderstanding. You kept the heritage alive, even while trying to deny its existence. Without your might, choices painful as they were, I would never have reached this moment." The honesty in her words, free of accusation or bitterness, broke something fundamental in Eleanor's carefully constructed defenses. She collapsed to her knees, sobbing with the weight of decades spent in willful ignorance of her daughter's true nature. Father Benedict approached cautiously, his vial of liquid silver forgotten in his trembling hands. "Child, if what you say is true, if your power truly serves the light, then the Church has been wrong about the nature of supernatural redemption." "Not wrong," Mara corrected gently. "Incomplete. You've seen only the darkness that exists without balance, the power that grows without compassion to guide it. You've never witnessed what becomes possible when mortal wisdom tempers immortal strength." She turned to Sir Gareth, who still held his blessed sword, but no longer seemed certain of his target. "Your blade was forged to destroy evil, Sir Knight. But what happens when evil chooses to become something else? What happens when a creature of darkness embraces light, not as conquest, but as partnership?" The vampire hunter's absolute certainty cracked like ice in spring thaw. The Church teaches one path to salvation. I offer another, not in opposition to divine will, but as its fulfillment. Mara gestured toward Eiran, who stood watching with wonder as his wounds healed in the presence of her awakened power. He chose to value life over death, compassion over cruelty, connection over isolation. If that is not redemption, what is? The unity chalice pulsed brighter, its light encompassing the entire courtyard in gentle radiance that seemed to wash away the last echoes of conflict. One by one, the vampire hunters lowered their weapons, their blessed steel no longer singing with holy fury, but humming with confused uncertainty. "What would you have us do?" Sir Gareth asked finally, his voice stripped of its earlier conviction. "What you came here to do," Mara replied. "Protect the innocent, serve the light, fight against true evil." She moved toward the chalice, Eiran falling into step beside her as naturally as breathing. "But do it with wisdom instead of fear, with understanding instead of prejudice." They reached the chalice together, their hands meeting on its ancient surface. The moment their skin touched the starlight stone, power flowed between them, not the destructive clash of opposing forces, but the harmonious blending of complementary energies. Mortal compassion wed to immortal strength, human wisdom married to supernatural power. "I bind myself willingly to Lord Eiran," Mara declared, her voice carrying across the mountain peak with the weight of absolute truth. "Not as his victim or his conquest, but as his partner in service to the balance that protects this realm." "And I bind myself willingly to Mara Ashworth," Eiran replied, his pale eyes bright with tears that sparkled, like diamonds in the chalice's radiance. "Not as her master or her corrupter, but as her companion in the work of redemption." The chalice flared with light that seemed to touch the very heavens, and when the radiance faded, The transformation was complete. They stood hand in hand, neither fully mortal nor wholly supernatural, but something new, something that bridged the gap between worlds with grace rather than violence. Around them, the courtyard had become a garden where impossible flowers bloomed in eternal spring, and the very stones sang with harmonies that spoke of ancient promises finally fulfilled. 6 months after the transformation, spring arrived early in the Blackwood Mountains. Where once the peaks had been shrouded in perpetual winter shadow, now gentle warmth touched even the highest elevations. The change wasn't magical in any dramatic sense, simply the natural result of a domain finally in balance with itself, no longer fighting the endless war between light and darkness that had defined it for centuries. Mara stood in what had once been the castle's neglected garden, now a masterpiece of cultivation that drew visitors from distant kingdoms. The garden's first rose, a bloom of impossible beauty that had appeared on the morning after her binding to Eiran, caught the early sunlight in its petals like captured starfire. This single flower had become the symbol of their achievement, proof that beauty could flourish where once only loneliness had grown. "The delegation from the capital arrives this afternoon," Eiran said, joining her among the flowering beds with the easy grace that had replaced his former supernatural stillness. The binding had changed him as profoundly as it had changed her, tempering his otherworldly power with renewed humanity while leaving his essential strength intact. "Let them come," Mara replied, her hands deep in soil that responded to her touch like an old friend. "They'll find what everyone finds now, domain at peace with itself and its place in the world." The transformation of Blackwood Peak had been gradual but undeniable. Trade routes that had avoided the Vampire's Mountain for generations now passed through regularly, bringing prosperity to villages that had known only fear. Scholars came to study the unique balance of natural and supernatural forces that Mara and Eiran had achieved together. Even the Church, after lengthy theological debates, had recognized their union as a form of divine providence rather than unholy corruption. "Your sister's letter came this morning," Eiran said, producing a scroll sealed with the Ashworth crest, restored now to its former glory, as the family's fortunes had improved alongside their domain's reputation. Mara accepted the letter with a smile, though she already knew its contents. Lyanna wrote regularly now, their relationship rebuilt on honesty rather than the cruel comparisons that had poisoned their childhood. The younger woman had found her own path to happiness, marrying for love rather than political necessity, and discovering that genuine beauty came from character rather than mere appearance. "She's asking if we might visit for the harvest festival," Mara said after scanning the familiar handwriting. "The whole family will be there. Even Marcus has found someone willing to tolerate his calculating nature. And will we go? I think we should. It's important that people see us as part of their world, not separate from it." She looked up at him, noting how the morning light caught the silver threading through his dark hair, a sign of the mortality he was slowly reclaiming. "Besides, I want to see how Mother's herb garden is progressing. The seeds I sent should be producing remarkable results by now." Eleanor Ashworth had embraced her daughter's heritage with the fervor of someone making amends for decades of willful blindness. The family's estate now boasted healing gardens that rivaled anything in the Kos kingdom, tended with knowledge passed down from grandmother to granddaughter and enhanced by understanding of the supernatural forces that flowed through their bloodline. A knock at the garden gate interrupted their morning peace. Mara looked up to see a young woman standing hesitantly at the entrance, travel-worn, bearing the unmistakable signs of a long journey and carrying herself with the careful dignity of someone who had learned to expect little kindness from the world. "My lady," the visitor called softly, "I've come seeking the Lady Mara if she would consent to see me." Mara rose, brushing soil from her hands as she approached the gate. The woman was perhaps 20 years old, with auburn hair and a birthmark that covered half her face in a pattern of deep purple that might have been beautiful if not for the shame she clearly felt about it. "I am Mara," she said gently. "What brings you to our domain?" "I'm Sarah Thornfield, from the eastern provinces. I've heard stories, unlikely stories, about a woman who bears a birthmark like mine, and yet found acceptance, even love." The young woman's voice trembled with desperate hope. "My family says I'm cursed, unmarriageable, a burden they can no longer bear. I thought perhaps if the stories are true, you might have wisdom to offer someone like me." Mara felt Eiran's warm presence behind her as she opened the gate wide. "The stories are true, but incomplete. Come, let me show you what's possible when we stop accepting other people's definitions of our worth." She led Sarah into the garden, where impossible flowers bloomed in defiance of season and expectation. "You speak of seeking acceptance, but I would offer you something better, the understanding that you were never the problem. Those who cannot see your value are limited by their own blindness, not diminished by any flaw in you." As they walked among the flowering beds, Mara began to teach what she had learned through pain and transformation, that true beauty came from strength earned through suffering, that worth was determined by character rather than appearance, and that love, when genuine, saw past surface flaws to the soul beneath. "Will you stay?" Mara asked, as they reached the heart of the garden, where the first rose bloomed in eternal splendor. "There's work here for those who understand growing things, and people who will value what you offer rather than dismissing what you lack." Sarah's tears fell like rain on the fertile soil, but they were tears of relief rather than sorrow. "I have nowhere else to go." "Then you're home," Eiran said simply, his voice carrying the warmth of someone who understood the gift of unexpected belonging. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the peaceful valley, the three of them worked together in comfortable silence, planting seeds that would bloom in their own time, tending growth that came from patience rather than force, creating beauty that would endure, because it grew from love rather than mere appearance. In the distance, church bells rang the hour, their bronze voices carrying blessings over a land finally at peace. The compact that had bound the Ashworth and vampire bloodlines for generations had been transformed from obligation into partnership, from fear into understanding, from isolation into community. Mara paused in her work to watch the sun set behind the mountains that had become her true home. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new visitors seeking guidance, new opportunities to prove that redemption was always possible for those brave enough to choose growth over stagnation. But tonight, surrounded by the impossible garden she had coaxed from barren stone and the love she had found in the most unlikely place, she was exactly where she belonged, not despite her differences, but because of them.